On commence alors? Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Oui.
Oui, très bien. Alors, bonjour et bienvenue à la conférence mini du Laboratoire de recherche interdisciplinaire sur les droits de l'enfant que nous organisons dans le cadre du cycle de conférences de la section de droit civil. Et la conférence aujourd'hui porte sur le droit des enfants à l'éducation en temps de pandémie. Et je suis désolée de ne pas pouvoir être sur place aujourd'hui. Justement, COVID oblige malheureusement cette fois-ci. Et avant de présenter nos conférencières, je voulais dire quelques mots sur l'éducation. Parce que l'éducation, c'est une clé essentielle pour la jouissance de tous les droits. Et je voulais vous lire un passage de l'observation générale du Comité des droits économiques, sociaux et culturels de l'ONU sur son observation générale sur le droit à l'éducation. L'éducation est à la fois un droit fondamental en soi et une des clés de l'exercice des autres droits inhérents à la personne humaine. En tant que droit qui concourt à l'autonomisation de l'individu, l'éducation est le principal outil qui permette à des adultes et à des enfants économiquement et socialement marginalisés de sortir de la pauvreté et de se procurer le moyen de participer pleinement à la vie de leur communauté. L'éducation joue un rôle majeur, qu'il s'agisse de rendre les femmes autonomes, de protéger les enfants contre l'exploitation de leur travail, l'exercice d'un travail dangereux ou l'exploitation sexuelle, de promouvoir les droits de l'homme et la démocratie, de préserver l'environnement ou encore de maîtriser l'accroissement de la population. L'éducation est de plus en plus considérée comme un des meilleurs investissements financiers que les États puissent réaliser. Cependant, son importance ne tient pas uniquement aux conséquences qu'elle a sur le plan pratique. Une tête bien faite, un esprit éclairé et actif capable de vagabonder librement est une des joies et des récompenses de la vie. So, we all know quite well, or at least we have some idea of the different challenges that children have had to face and are still facing in many cases during the COVID-19 pandemic. And many of those challenges were related to education, or rather the lack thereof. Nous avons ici deux conférencières qui ont beaucoup d'expertise en la matière et qui vont traiter de ces défis et de ce que ça signifie pour les droits de l'enfant. Nathalie Bélanger, d'abord, professeure à la Faculté d'éducation et directrice de l'Observatoire sur l'éducation en contexte linguistique minoritaire, qui s'intéresse notamment au processus d'inclusion à l'école, aux approches sociologiques en éducation et sur la francophonie en milieu linguistique minoritaire. Et si je comprends bien, elle nous parlera de la situation des enfants francophones et des défis liés à leur éducation pendant la pandémie. Et ensuite, Tracy Vaillancourt, who's a professor also in the Faculty of Education, cross-appointed in counseling psychology and the School of Psychology, and she holds the Canada Research Chair in School-Based Mental Health and Violence Prevention. Her research examines the links between bullying and mental health, among others. And I understand that her presentation will be at least partly based on the report of the Royal Society of Canada Task Force on COVID-19 that she chaired, entitled Children and Schools During COVID-19 and Beyond, Engagement and Connection Through Opportunity. And I'm assuming that Tracy will present in English and Nathalie will present in French. Toutefois, je peux confirmer que les deux conférencières peuvent ensuite répondre aux questions dans les deux langues. Et avant de commencer, je voulais peut-être mentionner aussi que nous nous intéressons au laboratoire cette année spécialement à la question de l'éducation et que nous organisons en mois de mai une formation sur l'évaluation d'impact sur les droits de l'enfant dans le contexte de l'éducation. Et j'en parlerai peut-être un peu plus tard, mais stay tuned. Et puis, joignez notre liste d'envoi si vous ne l'avez pas encore fait. Donc, merci d'être là et je vais passer la parole tout de suite à la professeure Bélanger.
Merci beaucoup, Mona. J'espère que vous m'entendez bien aussi pour ceux qui sont à distance. Donc, c'est vraiment, c'est tout un honneur pour moi d'avoir été invitée par le laboratoire. Donc, ça me fait vraiment plaisir d'être là aujourd'hui. Bon, à titre de professeure de la Faculté d'éducation, mais aussi de directrice de l'Observatoire sur l'éducation en contexte linguistique minoritaire. Donc, mon champ de recherche, évidemment, concerne beaucoup les écoles de langue française en Ontario, au Canada, et aussi dans d'autres situations minoritaires dans le monde. Donc, mon commentaire d'une vingtaine de minutes pour lancer la discussion, j'espère qu'on aura de beaux échanges entre nous, est basé en fait sur différentes publications qui sont encore peu nombreuses sur la situation des élèves, surtout des jeunes, lors de la pandémie. Donc, différents écrits, mais aussi un panel que nous avions organisé avec le laboratoire dès janvier 2021 avec des conseillères pédagogiques, des directrices de conseils scolaires et aussi une représentante de TFO qui a lancé la plateforme IDELO pour ajouter un matériel disponible en ligne pour les enseignants, les écoles, les élèves. Donc, comme on le sait, on n'a parfois pas très envie de revenir sur cette période-là qui nous rappelle confinement, restrictions au niveau des libertés, mais je pense que c'est important d'y revenir pour considérer l'impact que ça a eu sur les jeunes, les tout-petits, comme les adolescents ou les jeunes adultes aussi. Donc, on se rappelle que la pandémie a touché près de 200 pays dans le monde, mais de façon différente. Si, dans certains cas, ça protégeait les élèves d'être en situation de confinement, pour d'autres, le confinement avec la famille représentait plutôt, dans certains pays, finalement, des situations encore plus difficiles, étant donné le manque d'espace, le manque de technologie, donc une interruption de l'école aussi là, pour certains enfants dans le monde. Donc, c'est 1,6 milliard de jeunes qui ont été touchés. Des informations qui ressortent justement, et Mona l'a nommé, du rapport qui a été soumis à la Société royale du Canada et que Tracy a co-dirigé. Donc, ça a touché 90% de la population des jeunes scolarisés. Donc, c'est vraiment une situation sans précédent et on ne fait que commencer finalement à comprendre tous les impacts de cette situation-là. Donc, il y a eu des enjeux quand même assez importants, perte de contact avec les élèves pour les enseignants, mais aussi perte de contact entre élèves, entre jeunes. Une interruption pour les jeunes en particulier, mais aussi pour les élèves en situation de handicap ou avec des besoins particuliers, touchés davantage par cette situation-là, puisqu'ils n'avaient pas accès finalement aux mêmes ressources qui étaient disponibles à l'école auparavant. Donc, confinés à la maison, ça veut dire aussi des ressources moindres. Pour la petite enfance, des situations quand même inédites où on demandait à des tout-petits, en fait, d'être devant un écran. Donc, des situations assez contre-intuitives pour de très jeunes enfants, avec des parents là, qui avaient des ressources différentes, certains devant travailler aussi de la maison. Donc, ça faisait toutes sortes de situations assez bizarres. Pour les élèves du réseau scolaire, par exemple, en Ontario, puisque j'ai parlé de la situation mondiale, mais revenons à une situation que je connais mieux, donc les écoles en Ontario, bien, c'est une perte aussi de contact pour parler dans la langue minorée, finalement, hein, en Ontario. Donc, la langue dominante est l'anglais. Donc, les élèves n'allant pas à l'école, des chances étaient perdues, finalement, de converser en français avec les amis, avec les enseignantes aussi. Donc, des situations de famille, je le disais rapidement aussi, qui sont très contrastées, les parents, les familles, avec des ressources tout à fait différentes selon les foyers, selon les familles. Un accès à la technologie très différent aussi selon les familles, mais heureusement avec une réaction assez rapide en Ontario, du moins, et je le disais avec TFO pour les ressources en français, de production de contenu pédagogique pour venir en aide, finalement, aux familles, aux parents qui devaient répondre à la situation là, de la maison. Ce qui est quand même intéressant parce que vous vous souvenez qu'un peu avant la pandémie, en 2018, il y avait eu tout un mouvement finalement, de contestation par rapport au gouvernement Ford. Le gouvernement Ford voulait obliger les élèves du secondaire à suivre au moins 4 cours à distance. Et il y avait eu quand même une résistance par rapport à cela. Donc, c'était tombé à 2. Ensuite, la pandémie est arrivée Donc, on a été obligés de tomber finalement dans cette éducation à distance-là, alors que ce n'était pas du tout un souhait de la part des enseignants eux-mêmes, en tout cas du moins au secondaire. Donc, dans le panel dont je vous ai parlé tout à l'heure aussi, c'est intéressant de voir que, bon, les acteurs se sont beaucoup saisis et créé du matériel. Mais ce qui ressortait du panel avec les directrices de conseils scolaires, les conseillères pédagogiques et même avec TFO, c'est que les directions d'école, les directions scolaires étaient beaucoup dans la communication. On n'arrivait pas à répondre aux besoins essentiels des jeunes. Je le disais, par exemple, les élèves à besoins particuliers, handicapés, etc. Parce que les directions d'école étaient en train de créer des communiqués à envoyer à leur personnel, à essayer de communiquer avec les familles, à créer des protocoles. Donc, vous voyez aussi que ça peut avoir un impact aussi sur la réponse aux besoins des jeunes dans les écoles, puisque même au niveau des dirigeants, des dirigeantes, toutes les énergies étaient convoquées là, pour finalement créer, définir le message, essayer de communiquer entre nous pour des choses quand même de base. Donc, alors, par rapport à ça, on peut se demander comment ça a évolué, quelles sont les conséquences pour les jeunes. C'est vraiment ça qui nous intéresse aujourd'hui. Donc, j'ai trouvé ça intéressant d'examiner un article, et je pense qu'il y a un chapitre aussi dans le rapport que tu as dirigé, Tracy, un article de Janice O'Reilly et Scott Davis, qui finalement, de façon très intéressante, se sont dit, mais qu'est-ce qu'on peut dire sur la perte des apprentissages, des gains d'apprentissage des jeunes? Et j'ajoute finalement le risque que cela puisse accroître au niveau des inégalités, puisque je vous l'ai dit au début, les familles étant équipées de façon tout à fait contrastée, toutes ne pouvaient pas répondre à la situation. Alors, quelles sont les pertes au niveau des apprentissages? Ce qui est intéressant aussi dans ce qu'ils ont montré, ces auteurs, en fait, c'est de voir qu'au Canada, malheureusement, on n'a presque pas de données, contrairement aux États-Unis. Peut-être pour une bonne raison, parce qu'on a suspendu les épreuves standardisées de tests auprès des élèves, en 3e, 6e, 9e année en Ontario. Bon, évidemment, on peut voir ça pour ne pas les stresser davantage et puisque l'école ne se faisait plus dans des conditions habituelles. Mais d'autres choix ont été, on a opté pour d'autres choix, par exemple aux États-Unis, de continuer certaines évaluations, finalement, pour au moins recueillir des données, ce qu'on n'a pas au Canada. Donc, aujourd'hui, on peut déplorer cette situation-là. Donc, ces auteurs-là, ce qu'ils ont voulu faire, c'est une étude de prédiction, finalement, de dire, bon, quelles sont les pertes d'apprentissage chez nos élèves? Donc, ils se sont fondés sur des données recueillies dans le cadre du programme estival d'apprentissage financé par le ministère de l'Éducation de l'Ontario et qui visait une période de 2010 à 2015 pour des élèves là, jugés là, moins performants à l'école par rapport à un groupe pilote ou un groupe témoin. Donc, de voir quelles sont la perte au niveau des apprentissages. Donc, c'est vraiment une projection, mais qui est quand même intéressante. Donc, si ça vous intéresse, là, c'est, comme je disais, Janice O'Reilly et Scott Davis. Donc, il y a 3 scénarios pour un élève typique pendant la période estivale. Les élèves, donc, ne vont pas à l'école. Donc, ils ont voulu un petit peu prédire, est-ce que c'est la même chose pendant le confinement où les élèves ne sont pas allés à l'école pratiquement pour 3 mois aussi, hein, dans certains cas. Donc, est-ce que c'est une perte pour l'élève typique de 3 mois ou une perte de 6 mois ou voire de plus d'1 an? Donc, je ne rentre pas dans tous les détails, mais vous pourrez certainement consulter l'article si ça vous intéresse plus en détail. Mais ils ont identifié les sources qui impactent finalement la période sans école. Donc, vous comprenez qu'ils essaient de voir quel est l'impact sur le confinement, le fait que les enfants ne vont pas à l'école et comparé à la période estivale. Donc, c'est vraiment, ils regardent aussi les années préscolaires et le degré de préparation des petits à la lecture, aux mathématiques, à la communication, les écarts socio-économiques entre les jeunes. Donc, c'est un premier facteur d'impact. Un deuxième, l'absentéisme, donc l'effet égalisateur de l'école qui peut être compromis par une fréquentation irrégulière de l'école. Les suppléments acquis dans les familles, donc toutes les ressources financières, les ressources culturelles mises à disposition des élèves par les familles. Donc là aussi, c'est contrasté devant les différentes familles. Donc, essayez de tenir compte de cela. Et l'effet de l'été, finalement, c'est que les auteurs, pendant plus de 40 ans, ont étudié sur l'effet de l'été dans la perte des acquis. Donc, certains vont dire, je me souviens de certains collègues à la Faculté d'éducation qui disaient, en fait, oui, peut-être qu'il y a une perte d'acquis scolaire, mais les enfants, que ce soit l'été ou pendant la pandémie, et certains de mes collègues disaient, pendant la pandémie, peut-être que les enfants vont perdre des apprentissages scolaires au niveau curriculaire, mais ils vont gagner d'autres types d'apprentissage dans leur communauté, dans leur famille. Mais je trouve que c'est quand même un scénario assez optimiste parce que ça creuse, je veux pas, les inégalités, puisque l'école est quand même une grande égalisatrice au niveau des différentes populations scolaires. Donc, c'est un aspect important. Donc, pour conclure, et puis ensuite, heureusement, je l'espère, nous aurons une discussion. Ces auteurs-là, O'Reilly et Davis, ont conclu finalement sur une note quand même assez pessimiste. Donc, c'est encore plus de 3 mois, c'est encore plus d'une interruption comme l'été. Dans certains cas, ça va jusqu'à une année, comparable à une année de perte d'apprentissage. Parce qu'en fait, les parents ne sont pas des enseignants et les possibilités d'apprendre sont tellement disparates dans les familles, les quartiers, que les communautés, qu'il y a quand même un impact sur la vie des jeunes. Et il y aurait tellement à dire aussi sur d'autres aspects de socialisation, comme je le disais pour la question des élèves dans les écoles de langue française en milieu minoritaire, de voir un peu quelles sont les pertes au niveau de la socialisation, qui, on le sait aussi à terme, ont un impact sur la scolarisation et les acquis. Donc, il y a tellement de travaux qui restent à faire, donc peut-être de prendre le pouls, d'interviewer les jeunes eux-mêmes aussi pour revenir sur cette période-là. Donc, ce qui est intéressant, par contre, c'est de voir que aujourd'hui, on retrouve un peu ce discours-là de l'importance du travail enseignant auprès de nos jeunes, de l'importance des enseignantes dans la vie des jeunes et de cet aspect-là de capacité égalisatrice de l'école face à des populations d'élèves qui sont quand même très diversifiées là, au plan de leur accès à différentes ressources. Donc, voilà, je vais m'arrêter pour tout de suite, mais ça va me faire plaisir de continuer la discussion avec vous par la suite. Merci.
Merci, Nathalie. Moi, je suggère qu'on continue direct. I think Tracy will just switch right to you so that we can have a discussion covering both presentations at the end.
Très bonne idée.
Okay, so I think that our presentations are going to be very complimentary. So excited to be beside you, and thanks for the invitation. So I'm going to talk about mostly mental health and what happened to children's mental health in relation to school closures. And I think it complements what you just did because you really described the academic issues, although I will touch upon that a little bit as well. So first, we need to understand what the context of youth mental health was before the pandemic so that we can look at what actually happened during the pandemic, because it's not like things were good before the pandemic. So when we talk about mental illness or mental disorders, we're really talking about kids who are distressed and or have a disability. So that's what differentiates those who have emotional problems from mental disorders. So it means that they're not going to school anymore, or they're not going to their soccer practice. They're not functioning in their family. They're really, really anxious about how they're feeling and what's going on in their life. So that line is really often used in clinical research, but really it's problematic because subthreshold kids look very similar to those who have a mental disorder. And a lot of the work has been done in this area from my colleague here, Dr. Kreigsman, who's my postdoc student, who's shown this over and over again. So subthreshold levels do not differ from diagnosis in terms of comorbidity rates, in terms of the level of impairment, in terms of disorderhood, like disorders in adulthood, in terms of rate of treatment and risk for self-harming disorders. So really we need to be concerned about the kids who are over here and the kids that are near the line. So anybody near there is what we're worried about. So in Canada, 1 in 5 have serious mental health problems. So that means we've measured this across this line. 1 in 5 kids before the pandemic were over this line, and how many more were over here is less certain. And that relates to a prevalence rate in the world of 1 in 7. We don't have as much data from low income and medium income countries, although 90% of children in the world live in low and medium income countries. So really what we know about the mental health of kids across the world is really about kids from economically advanced countries. Canada has sucked forever when it comes to mental health. So if you look at the UNICEF report card from 2020, where they look at economically advanced countries, so the 38 economically advanced countries, Canada fares near the bottom. So here we're looking at child and youth well-being. We're ranked 30th of 38 countries. So, you know, there's always those reports that come out about Canada is the best place to live in the world. It's the best place to live in the world unless you're a kid. Then it's actually not as good. If you look at Canada's children and youth, how they fare in terms of mental health and happiness, we're 31st. So we're not doing a good job, and we weren't doing a good job before the pandemic. We know that suicide is an enormous issue. It's the leading cause of death among youth in high-income countries. It accounts for almost 18% of all deaths. It's a particular problem for boys, and it's a particular problem for Indigenous youth in Canada. So First Nations, Métis, and Inuit youth. And you see the flag of Canada is near the bottom. So of our comparators, our 38 comparators, we are near the bottom. Now, this has implications for adult mental health, which then actually circles back to children's mental health. So 50 to 75% of adult mental disorders begin before the age of 15. So there's enormous continuity, and you're going to see this over and over again. So it was one example from a study that was published with myself and Dr. Kreigsman. We looked at the trajectories of social anxiety symptoms. So we're not even looking at disorders in the prediction of adult disorders. So we have some kids who follow a high trajectory of symptoms, some who follow moderate level symptom trajectory, and those that are near the bottom. So I'm just going to compare those who don't have that many symptoms to those who have a lot of symptoms in predicting adult mental health. So if you follow this trajectory from grade 5 to grade 12, you're 20 times more likely to have depression in adulthood, 16 times more likely to have social anxiety disorder, 16 times more likely to have agoraphobia, and 13 times more likely to have anxiety. Now, these adults become parents who are not up to the task in a lot of ways because of their mental health issues. In adults, mental health problems are the leading cause of disability worldwide. They account directly to 14% of deaths. So mental health issues are entrenched, they're consistent, and they're persistent. Now, we know that the risk is not equally shared. This was true before the pandemic, and this was exacerbated during the pandemic. So we know that socioeconomically disadvantaged youth in Canada are less likely to, are more likely to have mental health issues. So in one study, 25 to 39% increase for children from low income families. That's a lot. We know that girls are more affected than boys for almost every disorder, with the exception of externalizing problems and autism spectrum disorder. Before the pandemic, only 20% of youth received services, and those who did receive services were the ones who had the more extreme, severely impairing disorders. So that means they had externalizing problems, because those are the kids that violate the rights of others. So teachers are really motivated to get these kids services. The parents are really motivated to have services. But then we have all those other kids that are suffering in silence with anxiety disorders, mood disorders, and the like. And we also know that recent immigrants to Canada are less likely to access mental health issues. And who are we bringing into Canada in recent years is individuals who come as refugees. So their history is just fraught with trauma. So this is a problem. There is a report that just came out yesterday from the People for Education, and it was a scathing report on how many mental health providers or professionals are available to schools. And the pandemic created a trajectory that went like this. There's not enough individuals to help kids in schools. We're not even close to it. Okay, so since COVID, so things look terrible before the pandemic, and what do they look like now? So I'm just going to talk about evidence that is high quality. I'm not going to present all of the evidence, but I'm going to present evidence where we have that we know from the research is the best form. So randomized control trials don't make sense during a pandemic, so I'm not going to present any evidence on that. Longitudinal studies are excellent evidence of harm. Meta-analyses are excellent, especially if they're longitudinal, and population-based studies that are longitudinal and a longitudinal meta-analysis of population studies would make me very happy. They don't exist. Okay. So we'll start with longitudinal studies. So we do know that internalizing problems increased during the pandemic. So we saw increases in symptoms of anxiety and increases symptoms of depression, more so for depression than anxiety. But look at, there's tons of studies coming out showing over and over again. So controlling for prior symptoms, we did see an increase. There are some people in Canada and actually in North America who are arguing against this evidence, saying that, no, this is a normal linear trend. They would have gone up even if we didn't have a pandemic. So we actually mathematically calculate whether or not that's true, and it's not true. It did go up. It went up more than what you would expected if it was a normal linear trend. Same thing with externalizing problems. So we saw increases in symptoms of ADHD, conduct problems, oppositional defiance problems. One of the issues with the studies here, though, is that we tend to use parent reports, and that confounds parent distress with the reporting of their children's symptoms. It's really hard to manage a child while you also have a job and they're on Zoom and you have all the stressors of the pandemic if they have externalizing problems. So the evidence here is a little less robust. So what about meta-analyses, and especially if we had meta-analyses of longitudinal studies? At the beginning of the pandemic, a colleague of ours who just joined the University of Ottawa, Nicole Racine, she's fantastic, found that 1 in 4 children and adolescents had clinically elevated symptoms of depression, and 1 in 5 had clinically elevated symptoms of anxiety, and it was particularly pronounced in adolescent girls, which every study shows adolescent girls are in crisis. There was another meta-analysis that looked at general mental health, and that showed that it had a negative impact during the pandemic, and the effect size was decent enough. This is interesting though. So this isn't about kids, but I want to talk about how kids are nested within families. So this one, they looked at a meta-analysis of the burden of depression and anxiety across 204 countries and territories due to COVID-19 pandemic. So they looked at the daily SARS-CoV-2 infection rates and reductions in human mobility and what it was related to. And what they found was that it related to increased prevalence of mood disorders, anxiety disorders. Women were more affected than men, and younger individuals were more affected than older individuals. But it created excess. So we talk about excess mortality, but we also need to talk about excess mental disorders. So now we have, and this is at the beginning of the pandemic, 53.2 million additional cases of mood disorder and 76.2 million cases of anxiety disorder. This is like not tenable. We know that kids live in families, and the mental health of children and youth is strongly linked to mental health of their caregivers. If the family is healthy, kids tend to be healthy. So we have this excess of mental disorder with adults, and we have this excess with children, and they're nested within a unit that's quite dysfunctional, not doing well. So back to Nicole Racine. So she looked at the prevalence estimates in a meta-analysis of mothers of young children. And to your point, they didn't do well. Moms with young children were very stressed out. The depression rate for mothers with young children was 26.9%, and for anxiety disorders was 42%. And it's interesting because Amanda has a young child during the pandemic, and I made it so clear to her, our focus is on you and your well-being and your child and your well-being. She had the kid with the runniest nose, so he was home all the time because he was a snotty little kid. But I wanted it to be very clear that we were not going to be adding to the burden of the stress during the pandemic. But not everybody had that. I'm not saying like a Mother Teresa here, but I'm a woman who works in academia, who has children. I recognize what the challenges were going to be. A lot of women had to work outside of the home while their kids were at home, with nobody taking care of them while they tried to do Zoom lessons when they were 6 years old. It was not tenable. So this is under embargo. So I don't know how widely distributed this is going to be, but hopefully not widely distributed until March 9th when the embargo is lifted. We looked at 11.1 million pediatric emergency department visits across the world. What we found was that overall there was a reduction in pediatric visits for health-related reasons during the pandemic. Nobody went to the ER. My daughter suffers migraines. We didn't bring her to the ER, or very rarely, whereas normally that's where she gets treated. We were afraid to go to the ER. Everybody was afraid to go to the ER with their children. But you know who did show up to the ER? Suicidal kids. We saw a 22% increase for suicidal attempts and an 8% increase for suicidal ideation across the world. Now, what is the downstream effect of this? So our other colleague in Coleman just published this yesterday. They did a meta-analysis looking at suicide ideation and attempts in adolescents and how it predicted adult outcomes. And it's terrible. The odds ratios are enormous. So adolescent suicidal ideation was associated with young adult suicide attempts, depressive disorders. Suicidal attempts were associated with adult attempts. Look at the odds ratio, 5.71. And young adult anxiety disorders, the odds ratio is 1.54. This is what Amanda's work has shown, right? So we have this excess now of suicidal attempts and ideation, and this is a great predictor, well, a terrible predictor, I should say, of adult mental dysfunction. Okay. Now, so what about a meta-analysis that's longitudinal? Also under embargo, okay? We have a paper coming out in JAMA. We looked at 53 cohort studies across 12 countries with 87 different study estimates of over 41,000 or close to 41,000 children and adolescents. We found good evidence for a substantial increase in depressive symptoms and strong evidence for a slight increase in anxiety symptoms. So not a normal linear trend. So what about population-based studies and ideally longitudinal? And there are no meta-analyses. So if you look at eating disorders, so this is data from the CDC, the top black graph is women or adolescent girls, and at the bottom is adolescent boys. And they have data from 2019 to 2022, and eating disorders went through the roof. What about in Canada? Looking at anorexia nervosa, which has the highest mortality rate of any psychiatric disorder. They looked at incidence and severity of newly diagnosed anorexia nervosa or atypical anorexia nervosa. They looked at it across 6 pediatric hospitals in 5 provinces. They had close to 1,900 youth meet diagnostic criteria. So here's the data from January 15th to just at the beginning of the pandemic, and the rates went through the roof. So this is enormous. And here's for hospitalizations, the exact same thing. What about poisonings? So here you have data pre-pandemic from 2018 to early pandemic 2020, increase in total poisonings of 122% at Toronto Sick Kids Hospital. The Statistics Canada asked kids, how's your current mental health compared to pre-pandemic? They've assessed them from September 20th to November, February 2022. And we're just going to concentrate on somewhat worse and much worse. Although there is some kids who did actually better during the pandemic. I studied bullying. Bullying was reduced. Bullying causes mental health difficulties. I imagine if you're bullied, it probably was better to be at home than at school and getting treated poorly. But let's just look at girls. There was a 61% increase from time 1 to time 8 on kids who said their mental health is worse. And this is a population-based study of Canadian youth. The CDC, this is the mental health children and young people survey. So this is a population-based survey that's longitudinal. And what you see is, again, deterioration, especially in older kids and especially in adolescent girls. The CDC came out with data in 2022, and they just released more data just the other day. And here they're looking at mental health, suicidality, and connection. And you see that close to 50% of adolescent girls said their mental health was poor during the pandemic. 56.5% said they had persistent feelings of sadness, hopelessness. 26% attempted suicide or considered suicide, and 12.4% of adolescent girls had actually attempted suicide. The new CDC data is horrible. It's suggesting that 57% of adolescent girls have persistent feelings of sadness and hopelessness. And that is an increase from 36% from 2011. Now, what's interesting about the CDC data, and this is going to bring me to school closures, so I'm getting there. I'm just long-winded. So the connection between mental health, connectedness and mental health has long been established. Like, kids who feel that they matter do better. If your need to belong is met, your mental health is better. So it's really interesting because when you look at the same CDC data and you're looking at whether or not they felt close or did not feel close, whether or not they learned in person or virtually, it's always the same pattern, that those who did not feel close to their teachers or their peers did poor. It's so hard to recognize emotions on a video call. Like right now, I'm taking a guess. Like, thank goodness we have some people in the room, and many of you are masked. Like, I'm taking a guess that you're enjoying this. I think you are, but it's harder. Like, you know, those who don't have a mask on right now, I'm getting this immediate feedback. It feels good, right? So this is interesting. We did a really large study in Ontario where we had over 5,000 kids, and some were in elementary school in person. Some were only in elementary school online only. We had secondary students who were blended, and you mentioned this, what it looked like. So, you know, they went to school and then they didn't go to school because we staggered their academic experience, and then secondary online. And we had this classic dose effect. The ones who felt that they mattered the most in grade 4 to grade 12. So the elementary kids felt if they mattered the most if they were in person. And the ones who felt that they mattered the least were the high school students who learned only online. So this brings me to school closures. What are the implications of school closures? Now, school closures have been co-opted by the right in the United States. So now anybody who talks about school closures gets lumped into being anti-masker, anti-vaxxer, you name it. Like the names you get called, grandma killer, whatever it is. I've been called them all because we wrote the letter to get schools open in Ontario. We said, this is enough. Enough is enough. You're causing harm. But it's interesting because of it being co-opted, it's really hard for people to be reasonable. I'm like as left-leaning as you get, right? I love Trudeau. You may not love him, but I love him. So like, it's just so interesting that people think I'm this like anti-vaxxer because I'm against school closures. As you mentioned, 1.6 billion students worldwide experience school closures. So 90% of students worldwide, and that would include university students. Ontario had some of the longest school closures of anywhere else in the world. For some reason, the science was different. So my daughter went to school in our house in online. And some of her best friends lived 20 minutes away in Gatineau and went to school in person. That was really hard to swallow, right? This contrast between one bridge and the experiences of our kids during the pandemic. I was worried about this and I wrote so many op-eds during the pandemic. I talked about their physical activity as just one example. We shut down soccer, we shut down ballet, swimming, you name it. I was worried that this would have an impact on kids, and it did. We now have Fewer girls participating in sports because of this. And that is also borne through meta-analyses. So another meta-analysis by the group that I've been working with, 20% reduction in daily physical activities from before to during the COVID-19. The evidence is now accumulating on what school closures did to kids. There's tons of evidence on academic achievement and safety. There's good evidence on loneliness and social isolation. The evidence on mental health is not as good, and on social emotional development, it's not as good. So I'll just give you a quick rundown and then I'll be done. So in terms of academic achievement, this is where we get the best evidence. So at the beginning of the pandemic, to your point, the Americans were still looking at academic achievement using standardized testing, even when schools were closed. So I used to always show this study because they looked at district level tests between in-person and hybrid, and they found that the pass rate decreased during the pandemic compared to prior to the pandemic. And of course, it was moderated by race and socioeconomic status. Okay. And to your point, there's also qualitative research coming out. So OISE did a study looking at secondary school teachers' experiences implementing this, and they said it was an ineffective and inefficient approach to teaching and learning. So even our teachers said that this wasn't ideal. Since then, the World Bank group came out and they looked at 36 robust studies. They found that learning loss was actually true. It was significant and real, because there's this whole other thing about learning loss is not true, because I think it's politicized because of who was against school closures. And it roughly equaled 1.5 years worth of learning. Since then, a new meta-analysis came out just the other week, 42 studies across 15 countries. The learning deficit was significant. It increased during the pandemic, it persisted over time, and it roughly equates to about 1/2 a year's worth of learning. And who was mostly affected? Racialized kids, kids who live in poverty, kids who need school the most. Now, there's also an indirect effect that people haven't started to think about, but we have. And it's not because we're exceptional, it's just because we've been knee deep in this data for so long. So my other student, Heather Britton, just wrote a paper on this, looking at what are the impacts of poor academic achievement on mental health problems, and they exist. So it's not just that poor academic achievement relates to poverty. Poor academic achievement also relates to mental health problems. And we need to be thinking about these indirect effects. What about safety? So just as one example, in one study from Hong Kong, 80% of children with special educational needs were psychologically abused during school closures, and 20% were physically abused. Family violence increases in child abuse related factors, but decreases in police reports and referrals to child protection services. Why? Sorry, I'll just go over here. Because educators are the primary reporter of abuse and neglect. So we don't have kids now, being detected for child abuse. It's not that child abuse went down, child abuse went up, as you see in this systematic review. But what did go down was who was telling the police about it, or CAS. What about loneliness? So we just published a systematic review where we looked at cross-sectional studies and longitudinal studies, and of course it went up. And going up, increased loneliness was associated with depression symptoms, anxiety, internalizing problems, mobile, gaming addiction, sleep problems, and decreased well-being. And if you look at the longitudinal studies, it was related to poor well-being. What about mental health? So the evidence here is a little bit difficult, and I'll explain why in a second, but here's one study of 5 European countries. Increased levels of stress, worry, social isolation, and domestic conflict increased during the pandemic, and the quality of education was poor. So parents in these 5 countries said that they couldn't do the task. Well, no kidding, they didn't go to teachers college. They are not trained as teachers. In a systematic review that was published in JAMA, they did find adverse mental health symptoms and health behaviors among children and adolescents, but they couldn't differentiate school closures from other social lockdowns. But there is another study coming out that's under embargo where they looked at 30,000 mental health visits to Alberta hospitals in the first 4 waves of the pandemic. Increases were noted. Teens were more impacted when schools were closed. They found 108, almost 109% increase from pre-pandemic. And mental health emergency department visits were higher during when schools were closed than when schools were open. But how do you then separate mitigation strategies, like closing the schools on 90% of the population, with 10.5 million children being orphaned or losing a caregiver across the world? So it's really messy trying to figure out what the direct impact is of school closures, with the exception of academic achievement. That one's pretty easy to figure out. And this is what breaks my heart, is we've had this viewpoint in Canada about our children, but I'm an advocate of the world's children. And across the world, this has been a disaster. So if we want to have a political debate from the left and the right about whether or not school closures cause more depression, fine, we can have it. But what drives me nuts is that we haven't considered what the implications are for children everywhere. So UNICEF just came out with this. Child marriage is rapidly increasing in the Horn of Africa. Not just in Horn of Africa, child marriages have increased in India. They haven't seen rates like this in decades. So what has happened across the world is school closures have led to increases in teen pregnancies, particularly in low-income countries. It's increased poverty. It's increased school dropouts. It's increased child labor, which is what Mona talked about at the beginning. It's increased early marriages, as I just gave you an example, and it's increased sexual abuse of children worldwide. When girls are not in school, they're married off. They become pregnant. When boys are not in school, they do labor that they have no business doing, very dangerous labor. And let's just look at sexual abuse. So this study just was published just today. Well, it's in press, but it was just made notable in the public. Here you look at annual earnings in US dollars and whether or not a person has been sexually maltreated. And this is where that it was an official record of child sexual abuse. Look at their earnings. So now they're more likely to live in poverty and their children are more likely to live in poverty. And one of the biggest stressors for children is poverty. So I get quite upset. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights outlines the fundamental rights and freedoms of individuals. And in Article 26.1 is that everyone has a right to education. In the Convention on the Rights of Children, they say that countries need to take measures to encourage regular attendance at school and reduce dropout rates. Have we done this? Have the rights of children been violated during the pandemic with school closures? This is what I'd like us to talk about, given everything that I said. We stated in a paper just now that a commitment to public health strategies can never include harming children and youth as a tolerated side effect. We tolerated this side effect because we hedged our bets on the idea that kids are inherently resilient. The only time kids are resilient is when the protective factors outweigh the risk factors. They're not inherently resilient. So I think that we, obviously, you know where I stand. Okay, and here's my new puppy. If anybody wants to find me, this is where you can find me. So I'm going to stop sharing. Okay. Arrêtez. Okay, c'est bon. Merci.
Thank you very much for that impassioned presentation in favor of children's right to education. Et là, on va pouvoir commencer la discussion. So I don't see hands might be up in the room. So
Allez-y.
Une question qui est un petit peu à côté, mais qui a une certaine relation avec tout ça. Donc, l'idée générale, c'est qu'il y a une diminution du rendement éducatif quand les écoles sont fermées. Mais comme vous savez, l'école maison se développe de plus en plus. Aux États-Unis, je suis sûr que il y a des enseignants qui vont probablement fonder des écoles maison en ligne, etc., des écoles privées, donc en ligne, et souvent pour des raisons religieuses, des fois pour des raisons de douance, d'autres fois pour des raisons de curriculum, ceux qui veulent une formation classique avec latin-grec, par exemple, et on sait que la formation classique, ça vient d'une époque où une infime minorité pouvait avoir accès à l'école, donc c'est une formation d'élite. Alors, si quelque chose comme ça se produit, est-ce qu'il n'y a pas une, comment dire, une façon, l'école maison, on pourrait penser que c'est une forme de formation d'élite, mais d'autre part, il y aurait peut-être des effets négatifs d'après ce qu'on a vu, d'après ce dont vous avez parlé. J'aimerais ça peut-être avoir votre opinion à ce sujet-là, parce que ça s'en vient de toute façon.
100%. And also it also circumvents vaccine requirements. So sometimes they create homeschooling to avoid vaccinating their children.
Oui, c'est ça.
Yeah.
C'est un peu, mais ça, c'est un peu accessoire, disons, parce que la pandémie, c'est quelque chose de différent.
No, but before the pandemic, that's what they were doing.
Ah, OK.
Because of the whole anti-vax movement that was associated with the MMR and autism, which never showed to be true. But anyhow, go ahead if you, and then I'll jump in or I don't know.
Toi aussi, si tu veux ajouter des choses et d'autres, ça se veut une conversation. Donc, mais je pense que oui, c'est un courant qui était déjà très, très fort. L'école à la maison par les parents ou les charter schools aux États-Unis. Et c'est vrai qu'on peut penser qu'avec la pandémie, cette situation-là va s'amplifier et c'est déjà probablement amplifié. Donc, personnellement, moi, je trouve que c'est quelque chose qui est quand même inquiétant parce que par rapport à l'institution, l'école comme telle, non pas que je vois l'école comme étant figée dans le temps, elle évolue constamment, mais c'est quand même c'est un peu le néolibéralisme qui devient roi là, dans cette idée-là d'une école à la carte où chacun pourrait avoir une éducation à la carte, soit donnée par les parents ou des groupes communautaires, des groupes religieux ou des groupes idéologiques anti-vax, je ne sais plus. Donc, malheureusement, la pandémie accentue ce mouvement-là de façon inquiétante. Et avec tout ce que Tracy vient de nommer, c'est très inquiétant au niveau de toutes les conséquences pour les enfants, pour les jeunes. Effectivement, c'est un très, très bon point et c'est quelque chose qu'on doit... Ce serait d'autres projets de recherche, là, peut-être à voir.
Ça peut être l'inverse, ça peut être exactement le contraire. Pour les parents qui ne donnent pas de l'école modernisée ou de l'école où il y a une certaine dégradation, y compris dégradation des mœurs, ils vont avoir une école maison très supérieure à l'école publique.
Oui, par exemple, comme vous dites, au niveau élitiste, si par exemple, ils veulent avoir un curriculum, il y a ça aussi, mais oui, ça peut être ça, mais au bout du compte, qu'est-ce que ça fait aussi? Il faut s'intéresser aux jeunes, les jeunes qui ne sont pas avec le groupe des pairs. Donc, je pense que cet aspect-là est quand même... Parce que là, c'est les parents qui décident pour leurs enfants. Donc, il y a cette perte-là de pouvoir interagir avec ses pairs.
Ça peut être encore un avantage si les pairs sont dangereux, disons, ou interprétés comme...
There's always going to be an exception, but we can't like nitpick it to the point where now we have, you know, we've reduced it to one person out of a million, right? There's always going to be these exceptions. Of course, kids do better when they're not bullied. Of course, kids... But all of those things, like at the end of the day, and it's interesting about charter schools because chartered schools, when you look at those in the United States who really are for them, it's again back to the right. So politically right leading, no, it has implications because the reports on learning loss are being produced by think tanks that have political associations, leanings that are for chartered schools. So all of this, okay, but there's no evidence to support that this is the better place to go because they've kind of been outside of the preview of research. They've kind of fallen out and it's not like we can go in there and study them as much. So we really don't know what the social emotional consequences are of that. We really don't know if it promotes or hinders academic achievement in the future. We don't know if when these kids are adults, if they come back and think about their experience and say, this was a great experience or not. So like, we're kind of in the dark, taking a guess at what's going on. So I'll just say this. So if you're going to come in the fold and argue for this, then be transparent, not meaning you, but they need to be transparent so that we can see if this works or not.
Exactement.
Yes.
Et alors, ça veut dire simplement qu'il faut des études supplémentaires sur ce cas.
Yeah,
sur ce
exactly.
problème.
Voilà,
Oui.
ouais, c'est ce que je proposais aussi tout à l'heure. Je pense que c'est un champ très intéressant qui n'est pas encore beaucoup examiné. Puis pour faire suite à ce que Tracy disait, on a vu aussi, par exemple, récemment, des jeunes là, à Montréal qui ont passé toute leur scolarité dans une école religieuse et qui, à l'âge adulte, justement, en veulent finalement à leur communauté parce qu'ils se sentent aujourd'hui démunis face à une intégration de vie sociale. Donc,
Mais justement, ça peut être le problème non pas de la religion, mais le problème de la société. C'est parce qu'il y a une espèce de conflit, mais ça ne veut pas dire que c'est la société qui a raison. Ça peut être la société qui est décadente, par exemple.
moi, je fais juste de rappeler le sentiment de ces jeunes-là, finalement, qui se sentent qu'ils ont été floués, hein, qui n'ont pas eu l'éducation que leurs pères ont eue. C'est toute une question aussi plus large au niveau politique, social, de la place de l'école dans notre société, puis de la valorisation de l'école, la valorisation de l'institution aussi.
And it's hard, like, in a sense, like there's a degree of tolerance that's needed, but it's hard because children's rights tend to be superseded by the rights of adults, and the rights make decisions for kids who don't have autonomy. And the rights, the decisions that we make need to be evidence-based. And yet we're not, in a lot of times, making evidence-based decisions when it comes to kids. I do think we need to improve the education of kids in schools, for sure. We do need to reduce bullying. We do need to have people's fundamental need to belong be met. We do need kids to feel that they matter. We do need kids to be, schools to be just as equitable as they possibly can. Like all of those things need to happen. But at the end of the day, I'm quite concerned about what's happening with chartered schools just because they're not transparent. I need transparency. I have a comment for you, which is really interesting because the Royal Society of Canada also published a report on ESL learners during the pandemic. And it occurred to me when you were speaking that we need to be mindful that we need better evidence on what happened to French language learners in places like Ontario, because a lot of times kids go to immersion school and their parents aren't francophones. So it's not like during the pandemic, they were experiencing French. But what happened to kids who were Chinese, let's say, and were in homes where the parents spoke Mandarin, their language ability in their parents' language actually improved during the pandemic. And that's what Janet Worker showed and wrote about in her report. But it never occurred to me when I was reading that report, and I probably should have thought about it a little bit better. I'm sure it probably is in there, but I forgot about what would happen to the language abilities of kids. So, a lot of times speaking French is about confidence, right? And wanting to persist is usually because you feel like you're good at it. So now if everybody is not as good at it, then maybe there's not going to be the same uptake, and we're not going to benefit from the cognitive flexibility you get from being bilingual, the enrichment that you have, our society's benefit, all of that. So I think there's something to be said about this or done about this. And it hadn't occurred to me until you spoke. So thank you.
C'est très, très important cet aspect-là finalement, parce que la pandémie aussi crée une espèce de vague de fond qui est en faveur finalement de l'anglicisation de notre société. Parce que, par exemple, dans les écoles de langue française, oui, il y a des ayants droit, leurs parents sont considérés des ayants droit, donc ils peuvent envoyer leurs enfants dans l'école de langue française. Parfois, les deux parents parlent français à la maison, donc l'enfant, pendant la pandémie, peut continuer à converser en français avec ses parents. Mais il n'y a pas l'accès à tous ses amis. Et si, par exemple, il y a un parent qui parle, je ne sais pas moi, arabe et l'autre français, donc peut-être que pendant la pandémie, là, on parle peut-être plus arabe à la maison, ce qui est très bien. Donc, d'autres apprentissages, bien sûr, mais la langue de scolarisation, finalement, dans ce cas-là, en français, ne sera pas pratiquée. Et au bout du compte, tout ça, ceux qui gagnent, ce sont au niveau de l'anglophonie de notre société, donc la langue majoritaire, qui va s'en porter encore mieux. Et pour la question des minorités, donc ça touche énormément la question de la pandémie. Je pense que Ça aussi, c'est des études qu'on doit faire encore au niveau des conséquences.
Yeah, I opened it on the side. Yeah.
Est-ce qu'il y a des questions?
Oh, it's not the discussion?
Je pense qu'il y a un commentaire et puis une question.
Okay. So John, do you want to read it out, Mona?
I'll read it out. So first one is the main problem in Ontario is that the Ontario Human Rights Code does not recognize age discrimination affecting children, but only as of the age of 18 years and older. And this is an area that needs urgent correction to align with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And the next one is, and then you might want to see if you want to comment on either one. Next participant is saying le COVID a amené un dilemme entre la santé et l'éducation, donc on aurait pu trouver un compromis entre les deux afin de permettre aux enfants d'avoir accès à l'école tout en préservant la santé de la population. Et ne pensez-vous pas que la pandémie a eu un effet sur le niveau éducatif des enfants, causant un recul des apprentissages? Et je pense qu'il y a des choses qui ont déjà été dites là-dessus, mais je ne sais pas si vous voulez, Tracy ou Nathalie, commenter sur...
Moi, je trouve intéressant le dilemme éducation-santé. Tracy en a parlé aussi tout à l'heure. C'est que quand elle parlait finalement que dans certaines juridictions, les enfants retournaient à l'école, mais pas ici en Ontario. Donc, il y avait vraiment un dilemme et la santé et l'éducation, la santé a pris finalement beaucoup d'importance, avec raison aussi, hein, bien sûr. Le but était de juguler un peu la propagation du virus. Mais l'éducation est quand même extrêmement importante aussi et on a perdu de vue justement les droits des enfants par rapport à cette situation-là. Puis en tant qu'intellectuel, professeur, on avait du mal aussi, je pense, comme tu disais, à exprimer. Il n'y avait pas place aux nuances. Il fallait... C'est vraiment incroyable. Il fallait être pour, même encore aujourd'hui, le vaccin. Bon, moi, je suis complètement vaccinée, mais est-ce qu'on peut quand même poser des questions sur les vaccins, la fabrication des vaccins? On dirait encore qu'on ne peut pas en parler sans se faire juger de conspirationnisme.
And a lot of the debate took place on social media.
Right.
So which doesn't lend itself to a discussion of nuance. But it's interesting, we just wrote a reply to an article. And one of the things that we said was, if you think about the precautionary principle, we closed schools under the precautionary principle because the evidence, we didn't know, under the assumption that transmission rates were high in schools. And that's reasonable. I mean, ultimately, we need to protect society. We do need to protect students and teachers. And then the evidence came back and has since shown that transmission rates were actually really low and that mortality rates were pretty low in kids. And I'm not saying that some kids didn't die and any child death is horrible and shouldn't be tolerated, but schools were not the vector of transmission and kids were not vectors of transmission like we assumed. Does that mean that that is misinformation? No, it doesn't mean that schools were closed based on misinformation. But the same tolerance for that idea that why we close schools is not given to the idea that maybe kids were harmed by schools being closed. And this is my point about politics do come in because what we have now is political talking points instead of reasonable discussions about science and nuance. And that drives me nuts because kids are harmed when we polarize the kids are okay or the kids are not okay based on political lines instead of based on evidence. And we wrote a commentary in JAMA Pediatrics about this because enough is enough. So people are afraid to ask reasonable questions now because you can get canceled. And this is my livelihood and it's your livelihood. I was called every name under the book, under the sun. I had so many threats levied against me when we advocated for schools to open. But we use the precautionary principle, just like they use the precautionary principle to close them. And that, it takes a certain personality to be able to weather that storm. How many people did we lose in terms of their voice in science and advocacy because it just wasn't worth it anymore to say anything?
juste pour élargir un peu, qu'est-ce que vous pensez de l'influence de Michel Foucault et du déconstructionnisme et tout ça? Vous ne pensez pas que c'est ce genre de pensée-là qui est derrière le problème dont vous venez de faire auquel vous venez de faire allusion?
100%. The other thing too is that it's interesting when the Russians invaded Ukraine, all of us scientists that worked in COVID stopped getting trolled for a few weeks. So like you have to keep in mind there's also nefarious actors who have been working towards destabilizing Western culture and Western society for many, many years. The anti-vaccine stuff predates the pandemic. But scientists like myself and yourself and people that are in the room got caught up on this and didn't sort of recognize that there's people behind the scenes who are less than appropriate in what their intent is.
Michel Foucault, he doesn't believe in truth. He doesn't believe really in, it's Nietzsche. And science itself is in question. Not just politics, science is it's very deep.
Oui.
Yeah, it's
And
deep.
it's from the left, from the 60s.
Yeah.
Oui, ben, je pense que c'est une lecture aussi des postmodernes. Je suis tout à fait d'accord avec
Elle est
vous.
un peu simpliste.
C'est ça.
Yeah.
Je pense que les postmodernistes aujourd'hui pourraient se retourner dans leur tombe à lire ce qui se passe aujourd'hui. Parce que là, c'est une version américaine d'une espèce de postmodernisme appliqué qui frôle le ridicule, là, vraiment. Donc, mais bon, il y a des aspects intéressants, je pense, par exemple, dans la pensée de Foucault, mais la façon dont c'est appliqué pose question. Moi, je voulais revenir aussi au niveau politique. Ce qui était vraiment enrageant parfois, c'est quand on entendait les politiques qui disaient il faut écouter la science. Alors ça, c'est complètement ridicule parce que la science ne parle pas. La science, on peut faire des méta-analyses sur différentes questions, puis ensuite, on doit voir les points forts, les points faibles, doser les aspects. Donc, si on avait, par exemple, pensé à éducation et santé de manière plus en parallèle, les deux, sans mettre toute l'importance seulement sur la santé, quoique c'était bien important, on aurait peut-être on aurait pris des décisions beaucoup plus éclairées sur la base de données scientifiques. Mais donc, moi, ça me faisait vraiment rire quand il disait, il faut écouter la science.
Well, and then also to that point, who had a voice? Who advocated for us? Public health advocated and health advocated, but did education have a voice at that table of decision makers? Did law, did children's rights? So like, it was really, we panicked. We were ill prepared. We had a pandemic plan. And then we were like, we burnt it, like right in front of everybody. And we're like, nah, we panicked. And then we relied on experts and the experts couldn't even agree. So it became, it's going to be really interesting. This pandemic, obviously, just like former pandemics, will be studied for the next centuries, right? And I'm just hoping that we have lessons learned. And the lesson I want learned is that children have a right. And their special needs, because of their age, their vulnerability, need to be attended to just as much as everybody else in society. And they did not have that. Like, I think they were so discarded, it drives me nuts.
Oui.
So I can't get off my soapbox. Okay, I'm going to just continue on that point.
Il y a un cas aussi à l'Université Laval d'un professeur, moi je ne m'y connais pas beaucoup, ce n'est pas mon champ, mais qui est en biologie et qui a critiqué finalement l'administration du vaccin chez les enfants à ARN. Donc, je pense que c'est le professeur Prévost à l'Université Laval. Et vraiment, il a été sanctionné de dire ça. Donc, au niveau des libertés académiques, je pense que c'est un aspect quand même qui cause problème. Et moi, je ne suis pas là pour trancher, je ne sais pas est-ce qu'il a raison ou pas, mais si quelqu'un a un autre point de vue, que cette personne-là le dise. Donc, est-ce que les vaccins ARN peuvent être potentiellement dangereux pour les enfants? J'en ai aucune idée. Mais est-ce qu'on peut quand même en parler? Je ne vois pas pourquoi cette personne-là est brimée dans son travail de scientifique.
Je vais attirer votre attention. Il y a une question dans le chat que Mona pourra lire.
Yeah, I was waiting for her. I think she was looking
Yes,
like
so it's Jean-Frédéric who's asking on linguistic insecurity. what role did inconsistent public health information and the lack of access to public health information in French in Ontario, for example, have on children's education? The education system generally relied on public health directives, orders to make decisions about children's education during the pandemic.
But was it not offered in French because everything out of our government has to be in both languages?
Non, mais justement, dans l'urgence, là, même je me souviens, avec l'administration Trudeau, ils ont dit, mais là, c'est tellement urgent qu'il faut sortir des trucs seulement en anglais. Donc,
I didn't know that.
C'est un aspect encore très
Yeah, that's a problem then. Well, you know, it's interesting, just as one effect of this, the Tylenol shortage had to do with labeling, right? So with getting acetaminophen and other forms of pain medication in Canada, that delay had a lot to do with they couldn't get the labels done, the translation done. That was part of it. Yeah, that's been
seulement, il manquait aussi
I'm not finished speaking. Okay. So that had an impact on the levels that came in. There was also not enough in the United States. Like there was a production issue, but then, you see this where like we're trying to make sure that families who are French can read the labels as they should be able to. And there's this inherent delay at getting, so they were trying to buy some from the United States to bring it up to Canada, which then had to get relabeled. So it's not like who usually comes into Canada and how the Tylenol is usually done. So like that, there's just one implication, like kids have a right to not be in pain. And yet that is being challenged.
Oui, il manquait aussi des molécules, je pense, à un moment donné, pour faire les médicaments, là, dans les chaînes d'approvisionnement. Ça, c'est quelque chose.
There was a production reduction. So I chair the COVID-19 task force for the Royal Society of Canada. All I've left is like COVID-19. There was a production issue, but one of the things they were trying to do is get medications from countries and they weren't labeled properly. That's been shown. Yeah.
Donc ça a un impact aussi sur les minorités linguistiques, un peu au Canada, mais ailleurs dans le monde aussi, où là, finalement, dans des situations d'urgence, elles ne sont pas considérées, en fait. Et donc, c'est là encore la langue anglaise qui prend toute la place.
Yeah.
C'est un défaut de planification quand même. Ce sont des choses envisageables. Le Tylenol, l'Advil, je veux dire, la composition n'a pas tellement changé. On pourrait très facilement avoir des étiquettes en réserve. Justement,
c'est pour ça que moi, je pense que parfois, c'est des excuses. Là,
Mais Viviana a une question.
Oui, en fait, j'avais une question pour chaque, si ça va. At the beginning of your presentation, I remember Canada being kind of at the bottom end of well-being and so forth. So I would be interested in knowing a little bit more about the services that are available to children and youth in countries like the Netherlands, who were at the beginning of, at the top of the chart. Like what can be done in terms of services? And so in another question for Nathalie, if I may. In the fall, in Ontario, so my kids are in Ontario, we were asked, do you want your kids to have online courses, to follow online courses for the next school year? And I said, no, absolutely no, no need for that. It's going to be okay. And then we just finished the courses selection this weekend for the next school year. And it just so happened that in French immersion, we were forced to choose online because the alternative was not offered in French. So I'm not sure in terms of the original plan of the Ford government to introduce more online options, if that, in what version is it going ahead? Because it clearly is going ahead. So I don't know if we have had time to really understand what the plan is now.
Bonne question.
Thank you.
Did you want to go first and then I'll...
OK.
Yeah, go ahead.
En fait, je pense que ça, c'est des... Donc, je ne sais pas si tu sais, Viviana, donc vous avez été, on vous a demandé votre avis. Est-ce que tu sais le résultat de...
Non.
Non, c'est ça. Donc,
partager au moins de...
Ouais. Parce que je sais que, bon, peut-être majoritairement, les gens ont dit non, on veut que nos enfants retournent à l'école. Je pense que ça doit être ça le résultat, mais c'est une hypothèse. Mais je pense qu'effectivement, il y a des choix politiques qui sont en ce moment faits, qui vont à l'encontre finalement de cours. Là, c'est dans le domaine de l'immersion, je pense, le champ de l'immersion, qui vont aller à l'encontre finalement de l'apprentissage, par exemple, du français. Donc, des budgets qui sont dirigés vers certaines priorités. Donc, c'est vraiment inquiétant en ce moment, je trouve. Même les écoles de langue française qui sont éloignées en région rurale, qui sont plus petites, mais là, on commence à dire, mais est-ce que ces élèves-là ne pourraient pas suivre l'école en ligne? Online, tu sais, donc, pour faire des économies d'argent. Donc, c'est vraiment un recul, je trouve, en tout cas pour la minorité francophone, où il risque d'avoir des questions sérieuses qui se posent là. Et pourtant, les élèves ont droit à une éducation comme les autres, finalement, d'avoir accès à une école près de chez eux. Donc c'est une gestion assez inquiétante. Ouais.
And in terms of why the Netherlands or other Northern European countries fare better than Canadian, their kids do better than Canadian children, we haven't looked at it specifically, but I could offer a few guesses. So there is evidence to support that when you invest in children's early childhood, then and invest in families in the early beginning of their family, that the outcomes are always better. So those countries do invest heavily in maternal care and childcare. So not only do they have often 1 year maternity leave, paternity leave, they also have access to daycare that's affordable. All of those things are going to help, because when the family is healthy, the kids tend to be healthy, right? They're nested within it. So we haven't done that. I know we've done a better job than the United States. And I think in some ways, having our comparator be so off the mark makes us look good because we make this comparison. But when we compare ourselves to Scandinavia as one example, we don't look that great, right? I had a baby in Sweden and I had a baby in Canada, and my experiences were so different. Like even having a baby in Sweden, they invest even in postpartum depression. They create baby groups for mothers so that they can have a group where they live in the same community and they can have access to social support while they've just had a baby. Even those little things make a difference. Along with my colleague Shelley Emo, wrote the standards of care for how to assess children's social emotional development for all EU countries. We don't have that here. So all the EU doctors know that social emotional development is important for healthy development of children, and they know how to assess it. So you have Canadians writing the standards of care for the EU, but we don't have them here. So just a few examples, right? There's a lot we could do. I think we would be better served. We now, in 2023, have a federal commitment to childcare affordability. And it's 2023. I had my child in 2000, and that was in place for decades in Sweden, right?
Moi, je me souviens comme en Suède aussi avec ma fille, tout petite, dans les poussettes, où les autobus sont prévus pour entrer facilement et tu n'as pas besoin de payer non plus. Donc, la gratuité dans les musées, pour exposer les enfants finalement à différentes ressources, sachant que les familles n'ont pas toutes les mêmes ressources. Donc, c'est quand même incroyable, ça, ouais.
And to that point too, like just even think about accessibility for people with disabilities or mothers and fathers who have a pram. Like I could barely walk around our university, and we are a G7 school. And you know, what if you were, you know, a working parent and you were bringing your baby to drop them off at the daycare? Like there's like little things like that. Like we say we value children, but we don't. Because if we value children, we'd invest in their families more and we'd invest in them more. like
Well,
saying these controversial statements.
I wish we had more time for questions, and I wish I could ask you lots of questions about, especially about how to fix the situation, because I just want to be, looking forward, and, we've messed up big time, and, children have suffered learning loss and mental health, and I've seen that also in my family very seriously. So, but I think that there's a class there at 1, and
Yeah,
so,
and we're happy. Yeah.
Unfortunately,
I think we do have to leave the room. So thank you so much. I'll get back to you separately then to discuss more about these things, Tracy and Nathalie. Donc,
Yeah, thank you so much. And great presentation.
Ce que je trouve intéressant, c'est la prévention aussi. Pendant la pandémie, comme tu disais, il y a seulement les visites d'urgence dans des cas graves, mais toute la prévention qu'on n'a pas fait, on n'a pas fait de prévention. Donc, malheureusement, on peut s'attendre dans les mois qui viennent à des situations encore plus difficiles. Parce que là, il y a des diagnostics qui sont en train d'être.
Yeah, no, exactly.
within that.
Yeah.